Reunion is part of a network of churches across Canada and one in Kuwait. And once a year, all of the pastors get together in Florida. And it was a really encouraging time. And we prayed together. We worked through some of Peter Scazzero's work, if you're familiar with any of his material. And it was just so great to connect with each other. And of course, the sun was awesome. It was just as I remembered it, warm and life-giving. And if you don't know, I'm from California. So yeah, I'm adjusting to the winter here. So the sun was great. But by the end of it, I was a little tired, to be honest. And you might be wondering, how could someone be tired after like a week in Florida? Well, I didn't get a lot of sleep, and I shamelessly admit that I'm an introvert. So being around people is life-giving, and also it takes a lot out of me. And so by the end of the week, I was really tired. And one thing I learned on this trip is that I can sleep anywhere. I slept on every flight, and I had a layover both ways. I slept at the airport. At one point, I woke up and was basically asleep on the woman next to me, like mouth open, drooling, just no shame. I'm sleeping wherever. And by the time I got back to Buffalo, which is where I flew out of, I was so exhausted. And I get on the shuttle that takes you to where your car is parked. And I hand the driver my ticket that says where my car is. And he says, "You're on the wrong shuttle." And I just felt like, oh, really? And I felt like something bubbling up in me, like some exhaustion and some frustration. And I said, oh, okay, because, I got on this shuttle because the sign outside says the orange parking lot, so I thought this was the right one. And he said, well, yeah, the sign is pointing that way. And it wasn't so much what he said as how he said it. You know what I'm talking about? And I feel that, like, the frustration bubbling up in me again, but I grab my suitcase, I drag it off of the shuttle, which, by the way, I swear my suitcase weighed over 50 pounds. So I get it off, and he comes out, and he says, that sign right there, that's the sign. Like, not that he was concerned that I wasn't going to get to the right shuttle, but he just wanted to prove to me that the sign was there, and that it was pointing in that direction. And I feel like the frustration bubbling up in me again. I think to myself, okay, I need to halt, right? Heidi, what does that stand for again? Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. When you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, don't engage in conflict. Just halt. And I'm like all of those things except lonely. I'm the opposite of that. I'm like, I have a people hangover. So I'm like, okay, I need to halt. But I don't. And I say, you know what, sir? It has been a long day. And I just walk away. And I feel all the anger like boiling up in me. And I think to myself, as soon as I get on the right shuttle, Grace, you kind of made a big deal of that. Like, that really bothered you. And it wasn't that big of a deal. What's going on? Have you had one of those moments recently where you feel like the anger and the frustration and it's bubbling up in you, and then there's that one little thing that just puts you over the edge? It's like that coworker that critiques the project that you spent 2 months working on. You put your heart and your soul into it. Or it's that family member when you're cleaning who says you missed a spot. Or it's that friend that cancels plans with you for the 5th time, and you just really wanted to get together with them, and you're ready to boil over, you're ready to lose it. Maybe like Annie loses it in Bridesmaids when she destroys the giant cookie. Do you know what I'm talking about? If you haven't seen Bridesmaids, it's a movie about these 2 best friends, Annie and Lillian. Lillian's getting married, and she has this new friend, Helen, who is beautiful and wealthy and like threatens Annie and Lillian's friendship. And Annie loses it when she gives Lillian this trip to Paris. There's this infamous passage in the book of Mark where Jesus seems to lose it. Like, it looks like he loses his temper and maybe even gets a little violent, like Annie trying to destroy this cookie. And this passage throughout history has been used to justify violence. And it's an important passage for us to consider and look at, especially during the series where we're talking about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. We've been going through this series all about discipleship, looking at what are the markers of discipleship. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And as we follow Jesus, we become more like him. So if Jesus loses his temper, if he gets angry, if he gets violent, does that mean it's okay for us to get angry, for us to get violent? So we're going to dive into this passage. It's in Mark chapter 11, starting with verse 12, if you want to follow along in your Bible. I'll have the text up on the screen for you. The book of Mark is all about the story of Jesus, so we're going to turn there together. Give me 1 second. So Mark chapter 11, starting with verse 12. It says, "The next morning, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off, so he went over to see if he could find any figs. But there were only leaves because it was too early in the season for fruit. Then Jesus said to the tree, 'May no one ever eat your fruit again.' And the disciples heard him say it. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, 'The scriptures declare my temple will be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves.' When the leading priests and teachers of religious law heard what Jesus had done, they began planning how to kill him. But they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teaching." Now, if you've been with us for the last couple weeks, we have looked at different passages where there's clearly conflict happening between Jesus and the religious leaders. Now, what is this conflict about? What is really going on here? Well, this conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders is something like this. It's kind of like that episode of The Office where Jim dresses up as Dwight. So if you're familiar with The Office, Dwight is kind of this, I don't even know how to describe him. He's like this very interesting, unique guy, and Jim always plays these pranks on him. And he dresses up one day as Dwight, and he talks like Dwight, and he acts like Dwight, and he does everything that Dwight does. See, Jesus shows up on the scene and starts doing all of these things that people would have gone to the temple for. Like last week, we looked at this passage where Jesus declares someone's forgiveness. That is the kind of assurance that someone would have gotten from the temple. They would have gone to the temple, they would have given their sacrifice and received the assurance of forgiveness. Jesus starts healing people just out on the streets. That's something that people would have gone to the temple for. Jesus is doing all of these things that people would have gone to the temple for, and it threatens the religious leaders, their authority. And they want to know, like, who is this guy? Like, by what authority are you doing these things? Identity theft is not a joke, Jesus. Millions of people suffer every year. That's what Dwight says to Jim. So this conflict is building. They're getting frustrated. Their authority is being challenged. And certainly there's a lot of things that Jesus is frustrated about. See, what you have to know about this context is that people would buy sacrifices at the temple. So you could come and you could travel and you could bring your own sacrifice, your own animal, but if something was to happen to it along the way, like if it was to get attacked or there was some blemish or was made unclean, the religious authorities would decide if it was clean or not. So they would basically decide whether or not you had to buy a new one. So maybe there's some kind of injustice, manipulation, exploitation happening here. And it also says that there were people exchanging currency. Like if you came from another area to the temple and you didn't have the right money to pay the temple tax, you would have to exchange your currency. Well, is this like US going to Canada or Canada going to US? Like, are the people possibly losing money in the exchange of currency? Are people being taken advantage of? And maybe what really upsets Jesus is that the people are missing the point, that the temple is not what it's supposed to be. Where is the worship? Where is the prayer? Where is the love of neighbor? Last week, Chris talked about how people who were poor, if you were sick, you were ostracized. You were cast aside. You were treated as less than human. You were out. Imagine it would feel somewhat similar to how people feel today if you have coronavirus or any kind of virus. Oh, you're coughing? Stay away from me. Don't touch me. Oh, you're sick? Don't leave your house. You've been traveling? Where have you been? Don't come near me. And while we do this with the intent of protecting health and safety, you can imagine how it would feel for the sick person. I imagine it would be somewhat similar to that. People being treated as less than human. Jesus says that they've made the temple a den of thieves. This is like their safe place, their hiding place. Like when you're playing capture the flag and you get back to your side and you're like, oh, can't touch me now. Like I'm safe over here. They feel like they have the temple, so they can't be judged. That's their safety, their security. There is a serious misuse of power happening here. So you can imagine Jesus is frustrated. Can you imagine the scene for just a second? Jesus shows up and just turns over the tables. Birds go flying everywhere. Coins all around. People just completely stop. Everything goes silent. And they look over at this scene, this chaos that is happening. What is happening here? Is Jesus acting violently? Does he lose his temper? Is this Annie destroying a giant cookie? You know what this really reminds me of? And I swear this is my last pop culture reference. It's that bit that Dane Cook does about Monopoly. Did any of you ever listen to Dane Cook? Maybe? Yeah, me either. He wasn't that cool. He has this bit about Monopoly, and he says, this is anyone 2.5 hours into a game of Monopoly. Forget this game. It's 4 a.m, Grandma. You win. I'm sitting on Baltic with nothing. And I hate when you're the banker. Where did you get all the pink 50s? Cheater. Is that what Jesus is saying here? This game is over. These people have nothing. You are monopolizing and misusing power. You don't get to play the banker anymore. Is Jesus angry? Does he lose his temper? Does he get violent? Oh, it's interesting, right before this passage in verse 11, it says, Jesus came to Jerusalem and went into the temple. After looking around carefully at everything, he left because it was late in the afternoon. Then he returned to Bethany with the 12 disciples. So when Jesus comes and turns over the tables, he's actually already seen the temple the day before. When he comes and this whole scene happens, he's not surprised. He's not caught off guard. He's not just losing his temper. This is like a dramatic demonstration. It seems like this is planned. Like Jesus goes to the temple to see if maybe there's any fruit there, like this fig tree. Like it's not the right season, but maybe just by chance there's some fruit and there's not, and Jesus comes back. And we have this dramatic demonstration where Jesus shuts it down. The whole system shuts down for just a moment. And sure, maybe in a couple hours it'd be up and running again. But in this moment, it points to a time when the system will be shut down once and for all. When injustice will end. Is Jesus angry? Yeah, I think so. I think when Jesus sees injustice, when God sees injustice, he's angry. And when you experience injustice, when you have been at the receiving end of a misuse of power, when you've been treated as less than human, Jesus is angry. You shouldn't be treated that way. And Jesus says to you, I see you, and it wasn't supposed to go this way. Does Jesus lose his temper? No, I don't think so. This was a planned, dramatic demonstration where Jesus shuts down the system. Now, as followers of Jesus, we talk about how we are called to peacemaking, but peacemaking is not peacekeeping. Norman Krauss, who is a theologian, says that from Jesus' example, the primary task of peacemakers is not peacekeeping. As followers of Jesus, we are marked by peacemaking, not peacekeeping. Or as the wise and passionate Chris Orm said last week, stuff is gonna get broken, but that's okay. Jesus shuts the system down. I don't know about you, but this gets me kind of excited. Like, this sounds good. Let's turn over the tables. Let's crush the patriarchy. Like, I'm in for that kind of peacemaking. Is anyone with me? Yes. Exciting? Yes. Enough contrarians in the room? Let's shut the system down. I want to follow Jesus there. Here's the thing, though. The empire strikes back. Okay, that was my last pop culture reference for the morning. The religious authorities and the political authorities strike back and they kill Jesus. Jesus gets angry. Jesus doesn't lose his temper. Does he get violent? It seems like he submits to it. Like he lets the system do its worst. They make a public spectacle of him. I want to follow Jesus to turn over the tables, but who wants to follow Jesus to the cross? Who wants to join him in that kind of peacemaking? They kill Jesus. They do their worst. Jesus allows them to do their worst. And they make a public spectacle of him, and then God raises him from the dead. And Jesus makes a public spectacle of them. Because they do the worst that they possibly can. They kill Jesus, and God raises him from the dead. And he overcomes the system of injustice and disarms the power by submitting and subverting it. Are we ready to follow Jesus to the cross? Are we ready for that kind of peacemaking? So here at Reunion, we have a practice every Sunday where I talk a little bit, and then you go in groups and you talk amongst yourselves in discussion. So I have some questions for you. How do we actually practice peacemaking in a way that's not just peacekeeping, but not exactly violent? And I think I have a slide for these questions, Josh. And this is a safe space to honestly talk about this topic. So what do you think? Do you think violence can be used to create peace? What are your thoughts about that? So take a few minutes and talk amongst yourselves, answer these questions, and we'll come back together, okay? So I want to hear what did you talk about in your groups? How do we practice peacemaking that's not peacekeeping? What did you all think about using violence to create peace? Is that possible, Jeff?
Yeah, a couple things. One was our initial reaction was saying, well, violence, the individual can take, but violence you take a person is something different.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm. But and we also talked about the history of war and war being incredible history all along.
Yep.
The Old Testament God is
right.
He uses on war and
yep.
your enemies and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the history.
So where did you land with that? Oh, okay. I'm like, did you guys solve the violence in the Bible? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I do think there is something about God having wisdom and understanding that we don't have when you look at the God in the Old Testament. And I feel like that's really like a longer conversation, but we should chat after. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
I said, well, just that God having wisdom we don't have. I said that as well for this scenario. Like, it seems okay for Jesus to
right.
be angry here, but if we're to apply it to ourselves, do I have the same judgment as God?
Right.
What to be angry about and what to do?
Mm-hmm.
So, is it right for us? I'm not sure.
Yeah. And that seems to be what's happening here, that this is an act of judgment also. So, yeah. Good thought. Yeah, Matt?
We had a very similar conversation, and one addition that we had was, if you look at like Judges, you had this like cycle of violence. Someone would come in, tell them what they're doing is crazy, and then like 20 years, 200 years, 300 years, 600 years of peace. And then the next generation and the next generation would be like, violence, this is fantastic. And then the cycle would start all over again.
Yeah.
So there is some sort of kind of like social evolution, whether it's with an individual or a group of people, where sometimes I even look at World War II.
Yep.
Where we can look back on and be like, that was crazy.
Yep.
But at the time, I really don't think a lot of people would view their actions in that way.
Yep.
That's a macro view of it.
Totally.
But as an individual, yeah, it's a challenge to understand the consequence of our actions in that moment.
Yep. And on the macro level, looking at different, like you're saying, wars throughout history and how the cycle of violence continues and groups of people continue the trauma and injustice that was done to them by other people groups. And it seems like, can violence ever really be a solution if it seems you just continue this cycle. Yeah. Yes, Tammy.
So you're talking partly about the difference between peacemaking and peacekeeping. So
Mm-hmm.
the fact for like peacekeeping is just, it might be keeping a false peace where there's an argument on both sides and one of the people is like completely getting their way.
Yep.
And the other one is like, well, we're getting nothing, but we don't want to start up a fight.
Right.
So that we just say, it's like, okay, like this is how it is. And stuff. For peacemaking, we kind of try and bring people together and like compromise where it's like, okay, well we're not getting, neither side is getting everything, but neither side is getting nothing. Peacemaking where they understand and then they're content with what's going on.
Yeah, like peacekeeping is, okay, there's a problem or a conflict, but we're just going to ignore it and just kind of keep the peace. Or peacemaking is like, we're going to lean into that. Let's have a dialogue about it. Let's try to work a resolution. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yes. Okay, cool. Yeah, Josh.
I think particularly on the individual level, like conflict is something that can produce, reconciliation, and the dynamics of that in all our interactions, whether on any level of a relationship with each other or community, society, God, all the rest. Like I think conflict can produce peace and that, but it doesn't necessarily equal violence.
Yep.
That we can work through things and having conflict and disagreements and debates and arguments, like that can make us stronger together, can unite us and then whatever, but treating it as something, think of it in a relationship, we're in this together to figure it out together. Not that we're necessarily agreeing on something even, but working through those conflicts is a different thing necessarily than allowing disagreements or emotional reactions to escalate to situations of violence, where we are now taking in a judgment and putting ourselves in the place of God's place to be a judge and to enact some sort of whatever that's not really for us, and I don't think it's conducive to what we should do.
Right. Yep. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, Heidi.
I think also another important factor to be more peacemakers is to be a proactive thinker. I had this intense discussion at lunch the other day with my coworkers about the pipeline, and one of my managers was just like, well, how do we fix it? Well, how do we fix it? Well, how do we? I was like, you know what? I was just thinking about it later, and I was like, well, it's kind of like a design flaw. Nobody considered the indigenous people when they were deciding the route for this pipeline. Maybe it's not that simple. Maybe the geography wouldn't allow, or their land extends too far. But when you think about things holistically before you start, then you're oh, well, let's anticipate the needs and feelings of everybody involved.
Sure.
How do we plan this, or what could be a potential problem of this action, or how we're doing this. So then if you are anticipating what might be a problem later, then you can potentially proactively do things to prevent that from happening, or avoid that conflict if you're just not jumping into things.
Yeah. So from the very beginning, considering other people, how they're going to be affected, how do we treat them as human beings even, and trying to understand that before moving forward. Because sometimes it's we create a structure or a system, and it's you recognize after you build it that it's unjust or there's some flaws, but instead of just breaking the whole thing down, we try to add things, but it's still not quite a solution, right? I don't know. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Maybe one more? No? Okay. Maybe. Tim or Kathy or Craig, did you guys have a comment? No? In your group? If that's, no, that's okay.
No.
Oh.
Yeah,
Also
we had a
Chris
good
is-
discussion around just wrestling with how much energy it takes to broker a truly kind of forward-moving solution when you're in the midst of conflict.
Yeah.
The difference between a peacemaker and a peacekeeper, that it takes a lot of preparation. Josh was here saying Jesus kind of scoped it out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of energy involved, or a lot of intentionality involved in what was happening, and sometimes we just kind of go into a conflicted situation reacting,
Yeah.
rather than really planning out what's needed to resolve this situation, which kind of goes to the issue of the pipeline.
Yep.
That it takes a lot of work, a lot of energy,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of times people don't want that.
Yep.
Other thing we talked about is, in the midst of violence, Jesus' solution is hard,
Yeah.
because he says you have to be willing to suffer violence.
Yep.
And a lot of times we want a solution without having to suffer,
Yeah. Without a cost.
without a cost.
Mhm.
But it seems like for Jesus, part of the equation is suffering violence.
Yep. Absolutely. Kevin, did you want to say something? I know you had your hand up.
I was just thinking about two things. One is sometimes where do you draw the line between peacemaking and peacekeeping?
Hmm.
There's a fine line.
Hmm.
That line could be hard to decipher. First thing, I don't have an answer, just throwing it out there.
Okay.
And second is linking to last week's sermon about the friends carrying the one person who was paralyzed
Right.
to Jesus, going through the effort of like coming down from the roof.
Yep.
And I was thinking for the past 1 week about Jesus responded to them by saying, because of your faith,
Mm-hmm.
that you are healed. I was thinking about it. The person who was paralyzed, he didn't really do much.
Hmm.
Maybe he agreed to be carried,
Hmm.
to the whole,
Right.
right? But it was actually his friends
Yeah.
that were doing all the work and on behalf of him.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that got me thinking about Jesus responded because of intercessory,
Hmm.
the interceding
Mhm.
of his friends.
Yeah.
And how powerful is that
Mm-hmm.
when we intercede through prayers,
Yeah.
through action?
Hmm.
I'm just wondering, like
Yep.
in this case of peacemaking, would it be more powerful? Would Jesus respond? Not that he would respond less, but would it be more effective? Or
Yeah.
because we got his heart
Hmm.
is to intercede and to act on behalf
Hmm.
of those who are being on the fringes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
To
powerful.
make peace. Maybe sometimes it's up to us, that is not part of the problem, to intercede for those who are part of the problem.
Yeah.
That would make a difference.
Hmm. Yeah, that's powerful. So peacemaking, peacekeeping, how do we sort of, like Jesus, absorb the violence or submit to it, submit to the cost? I remember a while ago at MCC, Mennonite Central Committee, they created this video about this woman, this family in Israel, Palestine. The Israeli military, when they were out of their house, came through and bulldozed about 1,500 fruit trees on their property, this land that had belonged to their family for at least 100 years. So you can imagine like how devastating that would be to come home and realize like all of these fruit trees were gone. And they said that the best thing that they could do for peace was plant more trees. And I just thought that was so beautiful and powerful, and a reflection of really the peace that we see in Jesus. The worship team is going to come back up here. We practice communion every Sunday. Jesus turns over this table, but he creates a new table. His followers gather around him, and he passes around this loaf of bread and this cup of wine. It says, "This is my body, this is my blood, take and eat," inviting us to participate, to join him in the cross, to participate in his suffering, to join him in his way of peace. And there are some of us here who have been on the receiving end of injustice, of misuse of power. And maybe we still carry hurt or anger or resentment over that. And at this table, Jesus says, I invite you to hand those over to me. I see you. That's not right. You weren't supposed to be treated that way. That makes me angry, but hand that over to me. Trust me with that. And there are A lot of us here also, like Chris shared today, who have acknowledged and are acknowledging the ways that a misuse of power and justice have benefited us, continue to benefit us. And maybe we carry guilt or shame around that, or maybe we're just wondering, like, what do we do? How do we be a part of peacemaking? And Jesus invites us to that table too, saying, hand me your guilt, your shame, anything you're carrying around that. Join me in this way of peace. So during this last worship song, will you come to the table? Will you sit at this new table of peace? Let me pray for us. Jesus, we're thankful that you create a new table for us to sit at. God, that you recognize the systems in the world that perpetuate and create injustice, God, and that you ultimately are bringing an end to them. That's what we see in this passage. That's what we see on the cross. And we just ask, God, that you would give us the boldness to follow you to the cross. In your name we pray. Amen.